Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be looking at the psychophysiology of politics. With me is Stephen Schwartz, the editor and publisher of the Schwartz Report, a daily internet newspaper. It's been available now for about 25 years, covering important trends that shape our lives. Stephen is a parapsychology researcher and an anthropologist. He is the author of The Secret Vaults of Time, the Alexandria Project, The 8 Laws of Change, How to Become an Agent for Personal and Social Transformation, and also Opening to the Infinite. Welcome again, Stephen.
My pleasure.
You know, we live in an era in which politics has become more polarized than any time that I can remember in my own lifetime. It reminds me of what things must have been like in our country and other countries just prior to civil wars, frankly. And I know there's been some fascinating research that you've been tracking for some time about differences in the brain states of people who are in opposing political camps.
Yes, I call it, as you titled this interview, as Psychophysiology of Politics, because as we looked at the recent elections in 2016, I could tell that there were very conscious attempts to manipulate a public opinion that seemed to correlate with things that I was also reading in the neuroscience literature. And so I really began to climb up inside of that issue. And I can't say whether it was a revelation or a nightmare, but it is obvious. I'm not the only person who's following this. I mean, to give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. I doubt that very many people know that if you put your polling place in a church or a school, that would, I mean, if I said to you, would it matter if I put it in the rectory hall of a church or something, or what if I put it in a school cafeteria? Would that make any difference? And most people would say no. I mean, whatever's more convenient. But the fact is, we know from research now that if you put a polling place in a church, people are going to vote more conservative.
Oh.
If you put it in a school, they will vote more liberal.
Interesting. I would have thought a church might bring out their compassion.
No, it brings out their judgment. We know now that, for instance, things which evoke fear and disgust cause more conservative voting. Mm-hmm. We know that a significant percentage of the American electorate have overactive right amygdalas. The amygdala is a little almond-sized gland in the ancient brain in the temporal lobe, mm-hmm. and it's associated with fight or flight. In all of the species where it occurs, it's always has the same function, fight or flight.
It's part of the mammalian brain, very strong emotion.
Well, it literally has a sort of heroic function, mm-hmm. because when you have a sense of great threat, mm-hmm. the amygdala kicks in. The only problem is...
Isn't it also associated with rage and anger?
All of that, yeah. but it associates, particularly in this context of politics, that it stops rational thought. Mm-hmm. You just act. You don't really think through very carefully. And this is the even more alarming thing, it correlates very strongly with conservative religiosity and conservative politics. Mm-hmm. We know, for instance, that the size of the cingulate cortex area, the amount of gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, part of your brain. If you have a more gray matter volume, and that this part of the brain is associated with one's ability to manage complexity. Mm-hmm. Where there is a higher volume of gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, you are more likely to be liberal. And if it's smaller, you are more likely to be conservative.
And now, how is this measured? Through MRI?
Yes.
It's not like autopsies after the fact.
Well, it's actually both. But yes, I mean, MRI, fMRI measurement, and also anatomical examination. Mm-hmm. But it's this correlation with politics. So one could say that politics is in your DNA.
Yes.
Because the way your neuroanatomy develops will be a strong predictor in whether you're going to be a liberal or a conservative. Mm-hmm. We know that, for instance, perceptions of disgust will produce significant changes in voting choices. Mm-hmm. Studies have been done, for instance, where simply having voting take place in a messy room, just that it's messy, produces conservative voting. Mm. Studies have looked at, for instance, where you go into to make judgments. If you go into a room where there's a bad smell, mm-hmm. you will vote more conservative. If you go into a space in which there are some kind of sensory cues that invoke value judgments about sexuality, mm-hmm. You will vote more conservative.
Well, it sounds like if I wanted people to vote more conservatively, I should create a lot of chaos, a lot of negative emotion, a lot of judgmentalism, finger pointing, and that will arouse the parts of the brain that trigger conservative voting.
All of those things, and then you want to put your polling place in a church. I mean, you know, I mean, it seems almost laughable, but the truth of the matter is, it is clear to me that people who manage political processes mm-hmm. are beginning to become very aware of this. Studies are now looking at, you know, the deep data and its effect on political voting, looking at word counts, search word counts, for instance, in Google as predictors of how people will mm-hmm. vote. If more people are searching for certain kinds of words, that now what that is doing, I think, is that as neuroscience and politics join forces, not an altogether comfortable marriage, but as they join forces, that the capacity to manipulate particularly low information voters, and particularly low information voters who have fears, and as you say, where you create chaos and fear, a perception, this is perceptual stuff, of some kind of threat, immigrants, people of another race, another religion, whatever, mm-hmm. where that happens, and you structure where the processes of democracy take place, you can manipulate the outcome even though there is no overt discussion of it. Mm-hmm. This is very subtle stuff, but very real. And as I said, I noticed in this last election that we had, and as we look back, as we go further along, it will be very interesting to see what subsequent elections, how, if I am correct, you will see more and more of this.
Well, suppose I'm a political liberal, and I want to activate the brains of people to cause them to vote in a more liberal direction. What would I need to do?
Well, you would need to put them in where the actual vote takes place. You would want to put them into an environment where they felt safe, and also in an environment where they felt other people agreed with them. Mm-hmm. That's why you see in the United States this what I call the great schism trend. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are literally breaking into two countries.
It seems that way.
In ways great and small. And so I think we're going to see more and more of this, because in the short term, for political managers, you want to manipulate the environment to produce the outcome you want. So we want to create more liberals, we want people to be calm, we want world situation or the national situation to be calmer and with less conflict involved. You want to try to settle values judgments so that they are not so inflamed, as we have seen recently. The difficulty and the rather sad news is it is easier to create disgust, which correlates with conservative voting, mm-hmm. than it is calmness and a sense of well-being, which supports the liberal side. So it's easier to provoke fear, anger, mm-hmm. resentment than it is support, brotherhood, and compassion.
It's easier to be destructive than to be creative.
Yes, that is exactly it. Where you cause change, things are in flux, there is uncertainty, there is stress, there is fear, there is a sense of resentment because of a perception, mm-hmm. whether it's real or not, that one group is getting more or better treatment than another group. Wherever any of those things happen, we're going to see more conservative voting. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty that we face is, as I say, it's much easier to produce the negative than it is the positive.
And the irony is very often the people who are voting based on that hyperactive amygdala typically vote against their own self-interest.
Oh, well, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the questions that I began looking at. I have done for several decades now social outcome research. I mean, that's what I care about. I'm not interested in political philosophies. I'm not interested in partisanship, except in an anthropological sense. What I care about is social outcomes. If you do this, what happens? And I began looking at social outcome data. I mean, take a state like West Virginia, for instance, mm-hmm. where you have people where one industry has dominated the state, coal in this case, yeah. where basically the entire state was a coal plantation. Mm-hmm. And the coal industry is dying, and therefore the jobs that are involved with mm-hmm. coal, they're less. I mean, to give you a sense of proportion, which is, I think, always important to get a sense of proportion, there are about 85,000 people, as you and I are sitting here, working directly or indirectly in the coal industry. Mm-hmm. That is less than the people working in solar in Southern California. So in the entire country, you got about 85,000. Mm-hmm. In terms of solar, you have 85,000 people just down in Los Angeles and San Diego and that just Southern California. Mm-hmm. So you would think that government in West Virginia would be actively looking around at, well, how can we create new kinds of jobs? How can we train people and all that sort of thing? And you would think that West Virginian voters would say to themselves, well, coal is doomed, and so we need to ask our legislators, our governor, to help us create new opportunities for ourselves and our children. Mm-hmm. But they don't. They vote over and over again against their own self-interest. You would think that if you lived in an environment that was constantly being polluted by coal debris and waste dumping into the water system of your land. If you've ever been to West Virginia and look at this mountaintop removal kind of coal process, I mean, it looks like a war zone. So you would think that people would be saying, well, gee, I don't want to live in a place like that. I'm going to vote for somebody that's going to stop that. But they don't. And they don't because when you invoke, as we were just saying, when you invoke fear and excessive stress, a sense of disorder, unclarity about what the future holds, a sense of resentment that others are getting something you're not getting, when that happens, when the amygdala kicks in, when you have lower gray matter, all of those kinds of things, people vote against their self-interest.
Well, it sounds as if there are two different issues here. One is perhaps a genetic propensity. Some people are born with a genetic wiring in their neurological system, so they're going to lean one way or another politically. Yes. And other people, maybe they're in the middle, but they get pushed to it by circumstances.
Yes, I mean, that's true. It's being manipulated. And that's the point I was trying to make. I didn't explain it very clearly maybe, but what I noticed in the 2016 elections and what I'm going to be watching for in the 2018 elections, 2020 elections, is I sense that political operatives, people who professionally manage elections, that they have become very hip to this neuroscience research and that they are structuring situations. I mean, if you think about that for a second, they're structuring situations which will produce effects that result in either conservative or liberal voting, most of it being conservative. We clearly can be, as a population, not specific individuals, but as a population, we clearly are and can be manipulated. If you think about also the whole rise of fake news.
Yes.
Because what does fake news, what's the function of fake news?
Typically, these are stories that provoke outrage.
Yes, and disgust, and stress, which provokes
the amygdala,
which provokes conservative voting.
Yeah.
And so you can see for instance, you have an organization like Fox News, which is, essentially a disinformation operation, in which or Alex Jones or Rush Limbaugh, these people that become these large figures in the conservative world who produce what amounts to an alternative reality, or as we're now calling them, alternative facts.
Yeah.
That is specifically designed to invoke in the listener or the viewer a sense of fear and disgust and outrage, all those things you listed, because when that happens, you get significant bias to conservative voting.
It's as if the human population is behaving like little more than a herd of monkeys if they're so easily manipulated.
Yes, that's true. The solution to it, of course, is high information voters. I mean, at the same time, you look at this, when you and I, we're of almost the same age, and when we were growing up, you took a civics class. Everybody. I think I did it in the 7th grade.
Yes.
Where you learned the 3 branches of government and what their roles were and how democracy worked.
What is expected of a good citizen.
Yes, exactly. They don't teach those classes anymore. We now know from studies that, for instance, during the Obama administration, more college students could identify Kim Kardashian than could identify Joe Biden. I mean, if you think about it for a second, it's quite extraordinary. The vice president of the United States was less well known than a woman who is very successful at what she does, although I'm not quite sure what that is, but everybody recognizes
Yes,
it. I saw a cartoon not too long ago in which the question was, how did the Congress vote? None of the students knew the answer. What did Kim Kardashian's dog have for breakfast? Everybody put their hand up. I mean, we laugh, and yet it's also a commentary on what's going on. Now, I think the question we need to ask is, what can we do to counteract this?
You and I have done a previous interview on, for example, meditation.
Yes.
Meditation is beneficial in almost every way for everybody, and I can't help but think that it also fits into the idea of creating a brain wave state or a brain state, a neurological state that is conducive to optimal voting.
Yes. Exactly. You take the words out of my mouth. Two things that we could do would be to implement mindfulness training. You can't call it meditation because religious people sometimes object to that. The Christians see it as some sort of Eastern, satanic, whatever. So we call it mindfulness training. You institute mindfulness training in schools. As I gave you the example in another of our interviews about schools in San Francisco and how they discovered that when they instituted mindfulness training, that violence dropped enormously, that dropout rates decreased significantly, that student attendance and student general health increased. So we institute mindfulness training. The other one is the quotidian choice. We train people to be aware when they're making a choice, and to consistently choose of the options available to them that which is the most compassionate and life-affirming.
And people have the opportunity many dozens of times a day, usually, to make life-affirming choices.
That's right. And I mentioned these two things because I think the takeaway, and I hope the people who watch this will take away from this interview, is that you have to become proactive to create a social awareness of the importance of well-being. And if you look at the societies that have done that, particularly the Nordic countries or New Zealand, places like that, where they make well-being a social priority, they teach their kids this in school, where you make available social institutions that support well-being, you create a culture in which people tend to stand together. They come together. They are willing to make sacrifices that will allow others to advance. That you can create a social structure which values compassion and well-being, and it has to be done on a proactive basis. I would say that one of my major criticisms of social progressives and liberals in the United States is that they are complacent. They take for granted that they resist things that they object to, but they do not proactively create things that that will support well-being and compassion. And that if we're going to survive as a democracy, we must begin to do this, because it is very easy to create negativity and disgust and chaos. That's easy. And that inevitably results in a more and more conservative and increasingly fascist kind of worldview.
And it can be a downward spiral, because as the worldview becomes more conservative and more fascist, as you point out, people become more stressed out.
Yes, I mean, it becomes a self-actuating trend. And so you have to take conscious, proactive efforts. You have to reverse those processes, because once they start, they devolve very quickly down into chaos, and that's where you get social revolutions and I mean really horrible outcomes that produce so much destruction that eventually people say, no, we've got to try something different. But I mean, that part may be good, but the getting there results in the destruction of the lives and the well-being of millions of people. And I would propose to you, at the very end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Dr. Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, came out of what we now call Independence Hall, and a woman stopped him on the stairs and said to him, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what have we got? A monarchy, an authoritarian government, or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if we can keep it." And I think that statement in 1787 is perhaps even truer today.
Really, it does seem as if we're on the brink of falling into an abyss if people aren't able to let go of fear and develop a sense of inner calmness, serenity, and I love the word that you often use in your book, The 8 Laws of Change, beingness.
Beingness, yes.
Stephan Schwartz, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure.
I'm very grateful for having your time here.
All right, thank you.
And thank you for being with us.